let me introduce you to our next speaker, who's also going to be talking about something very interesting. I think I'm very curious to hear more about what she's going to talk about. So we do have Kay Sargent here with us. She's a senior principal, director of thought leadership interiors, and she is going to be talking about sensory processing, cognitive well-being, and neuro-inclusion. So welcome, Kay, and I'll let you take it away from here.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be able to be here with you guys. And I have a ton of material that I want to share with you guys. So I am going to dive in. Let's get the screen going here so you guys can all see the content. And then we will go over there. Okay, everybody can see the screen okay? We're all good?
Yes.
All right. So I am a practicing designer of almost 40 years. And for us, this whole topic of sensory processing and neuro-inclusion really started with a simple question about 8 years ago when we were sitting in a room with a client and they asked us, how do you design for clients that are neurodivergent in the workplace? And quite frankly, we had an okay answer to that question, but we didn't have a great answer to that question. So we started to dive into it. And in that period of that 8 years, we have published multiple reports on neurodiversity, sensory processing, not just in the workplace, but even in complex buildings like airports, science and technology labs, arenas, healthcare settings, hospitality, a whole variety of things. And our research is continuing. We have 3 active pilots right now and multiple other studies kind of in the queue. And we have actually worked with multiple clients to help introduce these concepts into their workspaces so they can be as inclusive as possible. So let's just start with the basics. We're not all the same. Some impairments might look like this. Some might be like this, not as obvious. And some might be temporary, some might be permanent, some might be situational. But what we do know is that 70% of all disabilities are invisible. And many of those are falling into that neurodivergent category. So when we asked, okay, well, let's think about neurodiversity. What does that actually mean? Well, technically, we are all neurodiverse. We all process information differently. And so therefore, our brains are neurodiverse. But when we think about individuals that are neurodivergent, they tend to be individuals that fall outside of what might say are the norms for how you might respond to certain things or how you might process information or how you might interact with the built environment and your surroundings. And so those individuals, those neurodivergent or minorities tend to fall outside of those parameters. And that can include a variety of things. It can include autistic spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's, Asperger's, a whole variety of things. And so those are the individuals that we would refer to as being neurodivergent. Now, when we started our research, it was 1 in 8 people were considered to be neurodivergent. But now it's 1 in 5. And part of that is that 50% of the people that are may not even know it. There's a huge percentage that were never even officially diagnosed because, quite frankly, in my generation, you were just a hyper kid that couldn't sit still in the classroom, et cetera. And you didn't necessarily get diagnosed as being neurodivergent. But if you are, you're at an amazing company because there are some great entrepreneurs, scientists, authors, artists, people that are neurodivergent tend to maybe be challenged in one area, but can really struggle in one, but can totally excel in another. They tend to have kind of an entrepreneurial spirit. They tend to be highly creative. They tend to think outside of the box. And they tend sometimes to have a hyper focus and to be able to see things that other individuals may not be able to see. When we think about employing people that might have a disability, we are standing at a record high right now of 22% of the workforce has some form of disability. And it's estimated that 25% of the US population is living with a disability, but 70%, again, are often invisible and therefore are not necessarily identified or known. And what's happened in recent years is there's been a huge uptick in the number of people that are employed with a disability for a variety of reasons. It could be that remote working enables us to hire people that couldn't come before. It could be that the stigmatism is worn off, and so there's just a greater awareness. It could also be that we have a drought for talent and we're widening the pool that we're considering, and therefore we're getting more individuals that have some form of disability. And it could be that this younger generation is much more in tune with their conditions and is much more empowered and much more likely to identify as having a disability. Because what we also know is that there's still a lot of stigmatism around this. There's still a lot of fear of exposure. And only 4% of workers self identify as being disabled, even though we know that the number is significantly higher. So, this conversation is not about who you might hire in the future. What you need to be thinking about is who is in your organization right now that might have some form of disability that you don't even know about and might be challenged or masking or really camouflaging and really struggling in your space. And what's interesting is the World Health Organization changed their entire definition around this a few years ago. And they basically said that physical, cognitive, and social exclusion can happen and occur at a point of interaction between an individual and an environment where there is a misalignment between the two. So, put it more simply, individuals have impairments. If they're in an environment that is aligned, then they may not be at a disadvantage. But if the environment is not designed to support them, then they are at a disadvantage. And we can't always do something about an impairment. We can do something about built environment. And so therefore, we truly believe that we have a huge onus on us to really think about how are we designing for inclusion. And this is one of my favorite quotes from an autistic student who shared, "We are freshwater fish in salt water. If you put us in fresh water, we'll function just fine. But if you leave us in salt water, we're going to struggle to survive." And so this is really about making sure that we're putting people in environments that are well suited for them. And we also believe as designers that indifference towards people and the reality in which they live is kind of the one and only cardinal sin of design, because as designers and at HOK, we truly believe that we are designing spaces for people. That is our number one, uh, you know, our target customer base that we are really designing spaces for. And we need to think about it from that human centric position. Now, since the pandemic, the world has shifted. And now everyone has a heightened sensitivity to their surroundings. We're all much more aware of what we're touching, how close we are to people, what we're hearing, what's happening around us. And so that is also probably feeding kind of this heightened sensitivity to the spaces. So let's just talk about some of the basics. Let's talk about human functioning. So there is sensory, that transmission of information via the senses. There's cognitive, the way that we think or process information. And if you have children, you know that can vary significantly. And then there's behavioral, the way that we as humans interact with our built environment and the surroundings. And all of those can be impacted by our neuroprocessing and how we really kind of function and go through things. And so let's talk about our sensory thresholds. So when we think about this, people that are neurotypical tend again to sit into that predictable range of responses to an environment that they might have. But people that are neurodivergent tend to fall outside of that set norm. And on one hand, you can have people that are hypersensitive, right? They get overwhelmed by too much sensory processing. They might prefer less sensory stimulation, more organic, simple patterns, lighter things, natural colors, more spatial boundaries. But on the other side of this, we have people that are hyposensitive. They actually need more stimulation, maybe more layers and planes, more saturation of colors, more visual interest, spaces to move and fidget, physically engage with their spaces, or they might need background music or chatter to kind of really feel engaged in a space. And if you're hypersensitive, it doesn't mean the space has to be boring. It just means it needs to be ordered, needs to be structured, it needs to be purposeful, and maybe a little bit more organic, or not so many harsh edges, etc. And for people that are understimulated, it might mean that you need spaces that you can go, that you can physically interact and engage with, that you can touch, that are responsive, that are brighter and more vibrant. So hopefully now you're starting to see the challenge that in any space you can have both. And so how do you create a space that addresses the needs of people that are hypersensitive, people that are hyposensitive, and people that maybe are somewhere in the range in between those two? So let's talk about the senses as well. So when we think about this, it's not the 8 senses or the 5 senses that you learned about when you were in elementary school. There's actually, we have to think about not only acoustic, visual, touch, smell, taste, but it's our internal sensations. It's our body position. And it's our sense of how we connect in the outside world, that coordination and that balance that we have, that kind of our position in that world. All of those things are happening within us. And it's how we're receiving information and processing a lot of that that's coming. And when we get overloaded, whether it's a sensitivity to smell or a flickering light or an annoying sound, or something that's irritating you, it can lead to a physical reaction. It can lead to exhaustion, feeling overwhelmed, feeling irritated, headaches, nausea. All of those things can be attributes of having that sensory overload. And so if we put it more simply, sensory distractions, sounds, smells, visual clutter, lead to cognitive distractions, loss of focus, discomfort, and that can lead to loss of engagement and productivity, presenteeism, poor recall, stress, burnout, dissatisfaction. All the things that we're trying to avoid. And what I find fascinating about all these conversations that we're having today, we're talking about presenteeism and stress and burnout and all of those things, but we're not equating it to the sensory distractions that are often the root cause of what is leading to a lot of those. And we also think about our spiky profiles, right? So we all process things differently. Some people are that perceptive reasoning, that ability to visually take in information. And some people have to visually see something to be able to process it. And others can like find code, like they can see through something and they can find code, or they can see things that pop out really, really quickly, where other people might just overlook a typo because their brain is assuming that it's already there, right? They're processing something differently. There are other people that are verbally reasoning. They have to hear something to really be able to process it. And so in situations where we're communicating things, if we're not communicating it visually, verbally, in a variety, maybe written form, in a variety of ways, we may not even be getting to the target audience. Just because you said it didn't necessarily mean they heard it or were able to process it. And then we also have memory, that ability to recall. And some people have a very poor memory and others have an amazing memory. Think Rain Man, right? Where he had almost like a photographic memory. He could remember everything, etc. Heightened sense of that memory. And then we also have that processing speed. Some people process things very quickly, and others take longer for it to kind of ruminate or to kind of sink in. And it has nothing to do with our intelligence. All of these things, nothing to do with our intelligence. It's all about how you as an individual are receiving and processing what is coming at you. And that leads to spiky profiles. And so people that are neurodivergent tend to either maybe spike really, really high or really, really low, or excel in one thing at some extreme and maybe not so much on the other. Right? And so those spiky profiles is often another thing we really need to start taking into account how we're sharing that information. So over the years, we've done tons of literary reviews and research, et cetera, and we've put a bunch of information out there, our design knowledge, how that's impacting people. But we've also done a series of surveys. So the first survey that we did was 100% neurodivergent respondents. Everyone that responded to this was considered neurodivergent. And the interesting thing about this survey was 69% of those that responded were female, because most of the research to date has tended to be on adolescent boys. Women tend to be grossly underrepresented, and working class individuals also tend to be grossly underrepresented. But this is a condition that does not go away. In fact, it actually becomes more complicated as you age, right when we're starting to ignore it in many cases. And so the survey really touched on those two groups. 82% were between the age of 30 and 60, 69% were female. And there was a wide spectrum of conditions. 54% were ADHD, 40% were autistic, percentage dyslexic, and several of them had a comorbidity. They had a combination of those things. Of this group, about 47% consider themselves to be hypersensitive. 22% were hyposensitive. Now, just as an interesting note here, we believe over time this is going to shift, because right now the predominance is toward hypersensitivity. And that's where we tend to spend, the people that address this tend to focus more on that side of it. But this younger generation, who has really truly been exposed to technology since birth, is truly first digital natives. And their brains literally have been wired differently, and they tend to be much more multimodal, which means that we're seeing a higher percentage of individuals that are hyposensitive and actually need that additional stimulation in their life. And so one of the key things about this was nothing about us without us. We wanted to hear directly from individuals that were in the neuro minority about their experiences. And again, we wanted to really kind of address that underrepresented population. And what we found in this research is when we asked people what they were hypersensitive to, 3/4 had a heightened sensitivity to sound. 3/4 is a huge percentage. 77% is really high. And it's not necessarily that they all needed quiet. Quiet isn't necessarily the answer. In fact, sometimes super quiet spaces can be really creepy. It's about getting the right amount of sound in space. And right now, that's a real challenge because a lot of offices are underpopulated. And so you can clearly hear what somebody is saying across the room, which is far more annoying than if you went into a Starbucks or a space where there was kind of a general background hum and you just don't necessarily hear that. It kind of drowns out those spaces. The other interesting thing that we found is that 62% had a heightened sensitivity to visual stimulation. And what we found also, we cut this by gender, by age, a whole variety of ways, that women tended to have a higher sensitivity to visual stimulation. They actually liked visual stimulation and they liked having things that were more of interest, but they had to be ordered and structured. And when they weren't, then it caused a level of distress or chaos or comfort. Men tended to be less sensitive to touch and to smell, and autistic individuals tended to have a lower threshold for sensory stimulation. They tended to be more vulnerable to kind of the surroundings and the impact that it was having on them. And when we think about hyposensitivity, what we found again is that acoustics tends to be the biggest issue. But in this case, these individuals actually needed more sound. They needed to have either the right level of sound, they needed background sound, they needed to have something that kind of just kept going, right? Which is becoming, I think, again, a common trait we're also seeing in the younger population. And visual stimulation, et cetera, all of those things tended to start to kind of come forward as we talked about what are those things that people tend to be hyposensitive to. Now, about a year after we did that initial study, we said, okay, but it's uncommon to have a group that is just 100% neurodivergent individuals. It's very common to have a mixed neurotype, a general office population. And so we did some research on our own offices to really dive into this. And what we found in this survey is that 16% of that general office population, that mixed neurotype, identified as being neurodivergent. And again, the US average is about 1 in 5 or 15 to 20%. So it falls into that and affirms that. 55% were female, 71% were in that 30 to 60. So we had a 30% were either in their 20s or in their 60s or 70s. We did have a great mix, and a lot of those fell within that realm. Some we had a little bit higher percentage of people that identified as being ADHD, a little bit lower that identified as being dyslexic than the U.S. averages, but they fell pretty close to that. What was interesting to us is such a high percentage identified as being hyper or hyposensitive, and it was actually surprising to us. But I think when we look back on this, I think a we're architects and designers. So you'd like to believe that we are more in tune with our physical space and the impact that it has. And B, there's a heightened sensitivity now to this, and the veil or mystery is coming off. And so people are thinking about this more. And it could just be that they have a slightly elevated, but may not be really truly hyper. They have a heightened, but maybe not a hyper, right? So part of that we want to clarify as we go forward in some of these research studies. And it's interesting also that because of the pandemic, it really kind of affirmed that we all have this heightened sensitivity to this our built environment as we go forward. Now, our hypothesis for our latest round of research was picking up on what Kirsten Logston Smith said, who's a blogger, and said, autistic people are canaries in the coal mine. Our needs aren't necessarily different from typical individuals, just more intense and specific. Okay, so we basically, our spin on this is that our belief is that individuals that are neurodivergent are being more severely impacted by things that are basically probably impacting all of us, just not to that same degree. And so we wanted to test that out. So we compared the findings from the two groups to see how did this actually play out. And so the top line shows you the 100% neurodivergent population. The line below it is the mixed neurotype. And what we found is the main triggers, the things that were impacting them the most, tended to be the same, but to a lesser degree to the mixed neurotype population. Sound, temperature, and lighting are the three big challenges that people are finding in their built environment. And anyone that's ever done a post-occupancy evaluation would say that's perfectly in line with what we're seeing. The next thing I think that we would say is that the proximity to individuals and or the number of people you're around, again, we found the same thing. And for neurodivergent individuals, this was pretty high on the list. For the mixed neurotype, again, it was one of the things to consider. Now, somebody asked me once, did we think this was because of COVID? And the answer is, I think so, but I can't definitively say yes, because this was not something that we could find anybody ever asked before in any of the research that we had seen, which again, there was very limited, but we did not see that asked. And so we speculate that yes, COVID probably did have an impact on this. The other thing that has an impact on this is regions, right? People in Asia have a different sense of personal space and densification than people might in Europe and or in North America. So interesting to see. One of the things that we found fascinating and probably has caused the most discussion of all the things that we talked about in here was enclosure, because it is very common for people that say, oh, you're neurodiverse. So they assume in many cases that means they're hypersensitive. They can't take too much stimulation. And therefore, maybe you should just work at home or work in a private space or be by yourself. But what we found is that there were individuals that the lack of enclosure was a problem, but there were more people that found being in a confined space to be problematic. And the percentage difference in the neurotypical population was even higher than it was in the neurodivergent population, but again, to a slightly lesser degree. So this has kind of rocked a lot of people in the academic world because there was kind of this assumption. But when, again, we went back and looked, they never asked if being in an enclosed space bothered them. It was just if being in an open space did. And so the cure that they were offering might have actually been worse than for some individuals than what this initial situation is. So it's important that we create spaces that have options and choices because not everybody is going to want to be in an enclosed space. Not everybody can handle being in the open environment. And then, of course, pattern, color, texture, all of those things are impacting us as well, but to a lesser degree. Now, again, when we go back and we look at this, we're going to speculate, and it is speculation, that we believe that part of the reason this didn't score as high was because this tends not to be as much of a challenge in the space as some of these other things, right? Most environments tend to be on the blander side. They tend to be a lot of white boxes, a little bit of color someplace, very limited texture, pattern. But if I were to walk into a room and it was bright red with a crazy pattern and a bold texture on the room, I would probably have a serious reaction to that, especially if I had to sit in there for an extended period of time. And so this doesn't mean that these things aren't as important. It just means that right now they probably aren't as offensive or predominantly offensive in the built environment, but we still need to watch that and make sure that we're creating environments that address that stimulation. And so then when we think about, all right, what are the design strategies that you'll find comforting? So all the items that are in the pink in this list were from the neurodivergent population. But when we layer on the neurotypical population, general office space, you can see that in many cases, they were identical things in percentage-wise, a few exceptions. The mixed neurotype population had a higher proclivity for plants and greenery, and also access to people-filled spaces. Now, this is interesting because this happened when we had more people that were returning to the office, but not to the same degree that we had today. And in many cases, some of these offices might have been underpopulated. Being in a space that is underpopulated doesn't feel good. It doesn't have the right energy level. It doesn't have the right sound level. You can clearly hear things that can be disturbing. And so I think as that evolves over time, that absolutely is something that we're seeing was impacted by the pandemic and will probably morph and change a little bit. The other thing I think is fascinating about this is if you look about, 4 or 5 lines down, you'll see private space, because I think a lot of people assume that that's going to solve all their problems. And then 2 lines down, open plan, right? So again, it just reinforces that giving people options and choices, one size misfits all, and that not everyone wants the exact same thing. So when we asked about things that were uncomforting, the things that bothered you, again, noise, light, temperature, the usual suspects, but there's some other interesting things that pop up here. Busy and cluttered and messy spaces. I think most people grossly underestimate how much clutter and chaos can be real triggers for certain individuals, specifically women. And then smell is a very powerful sensation and sensory element, and that it can trigger memories. It can, anybody that has a heightened sense of smell can really be bothered by things. And so thinking about access to smells is important.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Kay. I really appreciate that. I mean, as an advocate for DEI in workplaces, a lot of what you've said definitely is very insightful. I think especially about neurodiversity in the workplace. So I really appreciate all the insights. We definitely are thankful that you decided to come and speak at our session today. I do not think we have questions at the moment, but I can circle back if I get any questions later on for you. So we might have to wrap up now so we can move on to our next session. But thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
Thank you.